I want to talk about one of the most influential and empowering women ever. This is the story of Elizabeth Smart. So this story starts with a man by the name of Brian David Mitchell. Brian was born October 18th, 1953 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Brian's childhood was marked by significant instability and dysfunction. And this does not excuse any of his actions. Many people go through shit in their life, and that doesn't mean that you can do the things that he did. It was said that his father had exposed him to explicit material at a young age, and he would also drop him off in the middle of nowhere to teach him about independence. Many believe that this influenced his later deviant behavior. His mom was also described as pretty controlling. Again, this is not an excuse. Brian's mom had testified in court about a time in 1970 when Brian had exposed himself to an 8-year-old girl. He was referred to juvenile court for this incident, and this was just the beginning for his horrible behavior. In his early adulthood, he became heavily involved with the LDS Church. It was around this time that he married his first wife, Karen Miner, and she was only 16. Their marriage was short-lived, and they divorced after having 2 children. Brian then went on to marry Debbie Mitchell, with whom he had 3 children. But like the last marriage, this also resulted in divorce. After the separation, Debbie had alleged that Brian had been abusing their 3-year-old. This was never proven, but his visitation did become limited. Brian later married Wanda Barzee. Brian and Wanda became increasingly isolated and delusional in their religious views. Brian ended up adopting the persona of a self-proclaimed prophet called Emmanuel. At some point, they drifted away from mainstream society and the LDS Church. They lived a pretty transient life and began engaging in bizarre religious practices. Brian one day felt called to add another wife into his duo with Wanda. And this brings us to Elizabeth Smart. Elizabeth was born November 23rd, 1987, and this made her just 14 at the time of her abduction. Elizabeth is the second oldest of her siblings, with 4 brothers and 1 sister. And y'all, she comes from a home that's just so obviously filled with love. These seem like just genuinely good people. She was always known as a smart, kind, obedient, and shy child. As a child, her greatest passion was the harp, and it was said that she would practice for hours each day. On June 4th, 2002, Elizabeth and her family attended an awards ceremony at school. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart won several awards for both academics and physical fitness. Early the next morning, about an hour after midnight, Elizabeth had been awakened in her bedroom that she shared with her younger sister. Elizabeth described feeling cold metal against her cheek. And this is when a man whispered, "I have a knife, don't make a sound, get out of bed and come with me, or I'm gonna kill you and your entire family." Elizabeth initially felt like this was some nightmare. And at first, Mary Catherine, which is Elizabeth's sister, was too scared to make a sound or move or anything. I mean, can you blame her? Like, what do you do in that situation? She was probably like, if I get up, I'm next. Immediately after her parents found out, though, they filed a missing person report, and they pushed her name out there to anybody that was willing to listen. A massive search hunt for Elizabeth was ensued that consisted of thousands of people. Don't quote me on this, but I think it was actually estimated that 2,000 people had participated in this search. Brian led Elizabeth out of the house and marched her through the forest for hours. They eventually arrived at an encampment where his wife Wanda was waiting. And Wanda was a woman with her own troubled past. Her children literally described her as a monster. And Elizabeth later described Wanda as the most evil person that she had ever met. So at some point after he and Elizabeth had met up with Wanda at the encampment, he performed some bizarre wedding ceremony. And it was at this point that he declared Elizabeth as his wife. And immediately is when he began SAing her. Elizabeth was kept tied up to a tree where she was often starved and subjected to daily SA. This camp was a place of severe psychological and physical torment during her 9 months in captivity. He regularly threatened to kill Elizabeth. They made her change her name and wear robes and veils to disguise her identity, and they often moved to different encampments to avoid detection. When Elizabeth wasn't being starved, she was made to eat garbage, and they forced her to take drugs and drink alcohol. And just a little over a month after he kidnapped Elizabeth, he attempted to kidnap her cousin Olivia. Thankfully, Olivia's mom was home and had been alerted by the noise, and this scared Brian off. Surprisingly, the couple would even take Elizabeth out in public, but she was usually wearing a face veil, so nobody could detect her. That is, until August of 2002. In August of 2002, they were at the library looking for their next location. A librarian had alerted the authorities, where they came to investigate. Elizabeth was wearing her disguise, and Brian was able to convince the police officer that they were just practicing their religion. So it was at this point that the police officer left. They even brought her to a house party one time where pictures of her had been captured. So remember Mary Catherine, the sister? Mary Catherine had heard the voice of the guy who took Elizabeth, and she described his voice voice being familiar. Mary Catherine initially had a hard time pinpointing where she had heard this voice from. That is until October of 2002. One day, she had just all of a sudden remembered crucial details about the abductor. Before the abduction ever took place, a man walked up to the Smart family and was asking for money. Elizabeth's mom gave him some money and also offered him a job. Well, Mary Catherine ended up putting two and two together and realized that the abductor's voice sounded a lot like Emmanuel, or none other than Brian Mitchell. Initially, the police were trying to dismiss this information, and honestly, they screwed up throughout the entire case. Police had been way too fixated on Richard Reese. He worked as a handyman for the Smart family, and they just didn't want to believe any other theory. Many people believed that the authorities got in the way of themselves, and they could have found her a lot sooner had they not fixated so much on Richard Reese. Richard maintained his innocence the entire time, claiming that he did not do this. There was never any concrete evidence linking him to this. Sadly, Richard ended up passing away due to a brain hemorrhage. He died before he was ever cleared and the true abductor was found. Thankfully, Mary Catherine's recollection of Emmanuel did eventually lead to Brian becoming a suspect. Obviously, the media went wild with it, and two witnesses ended up recognizing Wanda and Brian. The witnesses contacted the police, who then approached the trio in Sandy, Utah. Elizabeth was of course in her disguise, and after initial hesitation, she eventually did confirm her identity to the police. This led to her rescue and the arrest of Wanda and Brian. Brian was arrested and charged with the federal crimes of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and this was in 2011. Wanda was charged with the same things. She was sentenced to 15 years, but she eventually got out after 9 years. Which is just crazy to me. 2019, Elizabeth had alleged that she had been awakened by a male passenger on a plane and he was rubbing her inner thigh. She reported the incident and began a self-defense program for women and girls. Her journey from victim to powerful advocate truly is remarkable. Elizabeth founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. She's written a memoir. She speaks at events and promotes child safety protection legislation. So basically, she does everything. She truly is an inspirational woman, and I think we all need to take a little piece of Elizabeth and apply it to ourselves. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, comment, and follow for more weird shit.